Hello, this is Lilou, and I'm in Stockholm, in Sweden, with Eric Pearl, Dr. Pearl. Hello.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too in person. I've heard so much about your work.
There lies.
It's traveling the world, and I'm really
Yeah.
excited to participate in your seminar this weekend and see it for myself because it's so big and so huge. Sometimes it's hard to believe it's real, and I think you had actually that same problem
In the very
originally.
beginning, oh, absolutely. This was not the way I was raised. I was raised in a nice middle class, upper middle class family where, you study hard, you go to school, you get a job, maybe you get married, you have children who study hard and go to school and get a job, get married, have children. And I'm thinking, well, that's the cycle and that's what you do. And that's
Yeah.
all that I thought you did. So I became a doctor of chiropractic. I had a wonderful practice for 12 years, and one day my life turned itself inside out and upside down.
Yeah, because you had a very successful practice in LA, in Los Angeles, in California. And when did you notice, though, that something very special was going on?
One night after I'd gone to sleep, I was awakened by a very sudden bright light. I opened my eyes to see what it was, and it wasn't anything seemingly spiritual or metaphysical. It was just the lamp next to my bed. It had turned itself on. And I felt people in my house. It's a very discomforting feeling to wake up and feel people in your home that weren't there when you
Yeah.
went to sleep. So I got up bravely with a knife, a can of pepper spray, and my Doberman pinscher, and I decided to go hunting. Now, for anyone who has a Doberman pinscher, they know what the rest of the world doesn't. They are not the watchdogs people think. So all I can tell you is, when I first woke up, I quietly wanted to see what was happening, and she thought it was a game, so she starts jumping around. And then at a certain point in time, when she finally realizes something serious, where is she? She's behind me, wanting me to go first. So this was wonderful. So here we are, walking around the house, a knife, a can of pepper spray, and my Doberman pinscher pushing me from behind. Hunted for a good 20 minutes, couldn't find anyone. And I finally decided to go back to sleep, even though something felt strange. I thought that was the end of it. But that Monday when I went into my office, 7 of my patients, each independent of one another, said to me that they felt someone in the room with us, standing or walking or running. Some actually said it felt as if someone was flying around the ceiling. Other patients started telling me they could feel my hands before I touched them. And that was just the beginning.
But it's like, it seems when we read your book, because you also read a book, The Reconnection, it's like your whole story is like a series of people that came in your life, starting with your mother and how you were born, that came in your life, and all of a sudden, like, this gift unfolded. Can you tell us about, first of all, your mother, Louise Pearl, and what happened there when she gave birth to you?
Well, I can tell you the way she explains it. She was on the, I guess, bed or table
Yeah.
in the delivery room, and she felt little engines or motors starting in her feet and her ankles that were very loud, very loud. They were so loud she was looking at the doctors and everyone else in the room to see why they didn't seem disturbed by this sound. And she felt them further ascending up through her body, into her knees, into her hips, and she tried to stop them because somehow she knew that once they got to her heart, she would die. And it continued, moving up, and she didn't want to die, and she didn't want to die, and suddenly it got to her heart, and suddenly she was somewhere else. She was passing through layers, levels, maybe, of beings who had left the body. She doesn't recall specifically what the first or the second level was. The third one that she passed through was the only one that was uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable for those who were on that plane, and it was uncomfortable for those passing through. And that was the plane of the people who had taken their own lives. It felt as if they were detained there, delayed there for an extended period. She does feel that they do eventually continue through the cycle, but that was the one way. She instantly understood that was the one thing that we can do to interrupt God's plan. Mm-hmm. I said, do you mean it's like cheating? She said, no, it's different. It just is an interruption of God's plan. I mean, this is the second chapter of the book. It was the most difficult chapter for me to write because I had to spend so much time on the phone with my mother trying to get it just right. And even here, the words don't come exactly to describe what was there. But as she continued moving upward, she suddenly, well, first, she passed through levels of beings. You see everyone for who and what they are, clearly, without any facade. You recognize interactions and roles they have. You see people who have interacted with you from this lifetime, from other lifetimes. She passed through. She saw flowers of colors she had never seen before, never seen the flowers, never seen the colors, and continued. And suddenly, she was on a lane, which is what a lot of people tend to speak of as moving through a tunnel. For her, it was more of a lane. She wasn't walking, but she was moving. She was drifting along. And way down the far end, she saw this light, a really bright light. She didn't want to look at it because she was afraid it was so bright that it would hurt her eyes. But she couldn't help but look. And it became clear that there was no body, there was nothing to hurt, and it didn't hurt. She was brought towards the light, recognized immediately that this is home. This is where we all come from. This is all where we go to. And suddenly her life was laid out before her. There was no judgment, and yet she knew it was a good life, which I know sounds a little contradictory, to be without judgment and know it's good, but we view things on such a linear aspect here, and it made sense then. And she began to have an instant understanding of the secrets of the universe, why the grass is green, why the earth is round, why the sky is blue, how war is a temporary state of barbarism that we are going through, and we will get through that, we will get beyond that, but how utterly ridiculous it is for young men and now young women to go out and die fighting the battles of older men and women. She understood everything. It was such a wonderful place. And then suddenly, she found herself being sent back. And now for all the fighting and the struggling she did not to die in the first place, now she didn't want to leave. But she was being sent back. She knew she was programmed to forget all of the insights that she had, and she truly focused as hard as possible to hold on to these that she came back with, and she was told she had to come back to raise her son. And the next thing we know, there she was, and there I was. So I guess I was attached still to the umbilical cord while this process was going on.
And what were the doctors saying at the time? Because none of them would
Doctors
admit
didn't-
really what was going on.
Doctors didn't talk about that at the time.
Yeah.
She had an old-style country woman doctor.
Yeah.
Didn't talk about those things. But when she asked the practical nurse there what had happened, the practical nurse looked around because she knew she wasn't supposed to say anything, and it showed on her face. She said, "All I can tell you is, you were very lucky." The woman in the next bed, when my mother came to, said, "You were reciting scripture in tongues." My mother doesn't know the Bible in English, and she certainly doesn't speak any languages. So something occurred.
What was that for you, just looking back, before we go a little bit further in your story? Just when you look back at that moment, you being born and your mom going through this, what was this about for you? Is it because she was giving birth to you that this happened? Because now knowing what we know of you, what you're doing in the world. Why was she going
Everything,
through that herself?
we can look at this with retrospect and we can make supposition about it. We can make supposition about it. Was it a part of me that I had to be in physical form first to touch back to with her? I don't know. It's all guesses, it's all theories. I will tell you that I remember as a child, younger, wondering what death was. What happens when you die? Do you just end up in a box underneath the ground in the dirt? I thought, what a horrible thing. I didn't like that at all. But at one point she told me this story, and suddenly I realized there was no fear. She has no fear of death. She said, it definitely wasn't a dream. Mm-hmm. You don't wake up from a dream and suddenly have no fear of death. You don't. And my fear of death left at that point too. Even my understanding, my ability to accept even the closest, most painful death has changed with that. So maybe the bigger picture was, for me at a certain point in time, to begin to gain a concept or an understanding that would allow a recognition of a larger picture, that I could begin to carry that consciousness into the work that wouldn't unfold for me for decades later, so that when I found myself thrust from the position of doing the work only into the position of teaching it, that I would begin to have a level of awareness, of consciousness, to be able to teach a philosophy and understanding, an understanding that allows people to access this work, because without the philosophy, without the understanding, you can go to the seminar, you can learn how to do this work, but you will not bring it through without the consciousness of this work, because this takes us beyond energy healing, beyond the subsets of energy healing, Reiki, Jurei, Jinshin, Qigong, Mahjong, Beijing, ABC, EFG, Alpha, Beta, Delta, whatever you want to call it, the techniques that tell you to zip up your soul to protect yourself from negative energy and from gaining weight, things that have you shake off negative energy and spray it off and breathe it in to a count of 4 and blow it out to a count of 8. And all of these things, all of these fear-based rituals keep us locked into subsets of energy. And yet energy itself is a subset of what we can access when we allow ourselves to access this spectrum that science calls the reconnective healing spectrum, that science says takes us beyond energy into a continuum that then expands into light and into information, into levels of light and information that previously have not been known here on the planet. And maybe this is what explains why children with cerebral palsy or epilepsy or adults with other things going on, why once they interact with reconnective healing, no matter what they've interacted with before, if they're to have a healing, they tend to have it fairly instantaneously and almost every time it seems to last a lifetime.
So we'll go a little bit further into the reconnection and what it is and what it offers. And but really I'm interested to know a bit more about your story and how all this unfolded. Just for now, how tell me about this lady that you've met on Venice Beach.
Oh, we're going backwards now.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going back.
Yeah.
All right. So I had this chiropractic practice for 12 years. It was one of the 2 largest practices in Los Angeles. Very busy. And one day I ended a 6-year relationship that I was in. I should say it came to an end. I wasn't clearly focused. There was a lot of stress going on in the office anyway, and at that point, with this added to it, I really didn't have the patience for it. So I did what everyone in practice management tells you you should do, but you have not lived, trust me, until you've done this. I let everyone go at once. So there I was scheduling the appointments, answering the phone, filling out the insurance forms, stamping the envelopes, running after the postman. This lasted for about a good hour. I finally realized I needed new staff. I needed to hire quickly. I didn't hire so well myself the first time, I felt, so I brought in a professional team. We arranged for all the job applicants to come in on one day, open the door in the morning, and here they came. Tall, short, old, young, experienced, inexperienced, and then finally came this woman who was both the physical and audible incarnation of Fran Drescher's character, the nanny. Do you know, with that horrible voice? She was just so funny. The nanny wasn't even on TV yet to have anything to compare it to. Everyone huddled behind me quickly and said, whatever you do, do not hire this one, and I had to have her. I mean, I just couldn't believe anyone like this existed. So it was a love-hate relationship. I loved her, the patients hated her. I didn't realize that she was doing charming little things along the way, such as borrowing money from them. But that's another story.
Yeah.
One day she dragged me off to the beach. She said, Dr. Pearl, you've been under so much stress lately that you need to take a day off. You need to go to the beach, which really meant she wanted to go to the beach and she didn't want to spend her own money on gasoline, so there we went.
No.
A little while later, she wanders off. She comes back. She said, I found this woman reading cards. You need to get your cards read by her. And I thought, well, I don't have a problem with maybe experiencing a card reader, but I'd like to go to someone who comes with a referral. You know, she's a good reputation, not somebody who's set up on a beach with a folding chair and a card table. But she pushed and pushed and pushed in that nanny voice that finally it's just better to give in. So I wandered over and the woman said, we have $10 readings and $20 readings. And I had $20 in my pocket and I knew there were two of us. So I said, well, we'll take the $10 reading. It was nothing that stood out particularly as impactful, nothing dramatic, nothing significant in the reading at all. Except at the very end she said, well, being a healer, and I thought she meant my being a chiropractor, she said, being a healer, there's this work that I do and you need to have it done. So I asked what it was, and she explained, you see, the meridian lines that are on our body that acupuncturists use tie us into the grid lines that envelop the planet, and then from there they extend and continue out into the universe, tying us in to the system of stars and planets and even the space and dimension in between. Somewhere along the lines of time, we became disconnected from the system, and she did a work that could tie us back into it. I thought, well, that sounds interesting. How much would you like to do this work? And she said, $333. And I said, well, no, thank you, because I could think of lots of things I could do with $333, and giving them to some woman on the beach wasn't on my list. So I started to thank her and leave. She scribbled something down on a piece of paper. She said, here, you can read about it in a book called The Book of Knowledge, The Keys of Enoch, chapter 317. So I said, thank you very much. I left, thinking I'd pay no attention to this whatsoever. But I kept thinking about it, thinking about it, thinking about it, and finally I found myself at a lunch break at my office thinking, I have 10 extra minutes. I'm going to run into this bookstore and quickly find the book, skim through it, and then run home. Well, if you've ever seen that book, you realize there are at least 3 things you cannot do with it. You cannot read it, you cannot skim through it, and you cannot understand it. Outside of that, it's a wonderful book. The more I read, the more confused I became. The more confused I became, the more intrigued I became. I left. I came back another time. I understood parts I didn't understand the first time. I didn't understand the parts I thought I did understand the first time. After going back and forth a few times, I finally realized that maybe it would just be cheaper if I called the woman and paid her $333 and let her do the work. So I called her up. She told me there were 2 appointments 2 days apart. I went in for day 1. She placed me on the massage table, dimmed the lights, put on the new age tinkly music that we've all grown to know and love, and started taking her fingertips and tracing these little line patterns all over my body while I'm lying there thinking, I cannot believe I paid this woman money to be doing this, and all this negative chatter going off in my head when finally I realized I did pay her. So I might as well let go of the chatter and see what happens. So I drifted off as she finished this work over the next, 45 minutes, an hour. At the end, she touched me lightly as if the earth had moved. Keep your eyes closed, she said. Open your eyes slowly. Hold on to me. Take your feet. Feel for the ground. I'm thinking, isn't it where I left it? She said, no. I'll keep your balance. And you begin to walk slowly through the room. And I'm thinking, you know, lady, I don't really know what went on here, but whatever it was, I missed it. But I went through the get back in your body dance with her. I thanked her very much, and I left, thinking that there was absolutely nothing more ridiculous I could possibly have done than agreed to come back for part 2. I went home. I went home. Nothing changed. I went to sleep, and that was the night I woke up, and the light had come bursting through my eyes. The next day was a normal day. Saturday was a normal day. Sunday I went back for part 2. She placed me on the table, dimmed the lights again, put on the New Age tinkly music, and began tracing the little line patterns over my body. But this time it was different. First of all, I couldn't seem to lie still. My body wanted to shift, it wanted to move. At the end of the session, and mind you, this was a tiny little non-air conditioned apartment way down in Southern California, August, peak of summer. And
Hot.
yet when she, hot, oppressively hot. And yet when she finished the session, I was so chilled that she had to wrap me in a blanket for a good 5 minutes. Something had happened. I experienced a peace, a sense of peace that on one hand I had never known, and the other hand was more familiar than anything I'd ever known. I remember thanking her, leaving, getting into my car, starting the ignition and beginning the drive home. It was as if I can feel the car with me behind the wheel beginning to drift home. I don't remember another thing. I don't remember arriving home. I don't remember going to sleep that night. I don't recall getting up in the morning. I don't remember going into the office. I don't remember the beginning of the morning. I just know at some point in the morning, I was standing in the hallway. It's almost as if my brain had been lifted out of my head and put back in, or a feeling as if maybe what I would assume it would be like if you went under anesthesia for surgery and then you came out and suddenly you're aware, but the world is moving around you and you're just in it. And 2 of my employees were standing in front of me and they said, "What did you do this weekend? What happened to you?"
Your face was different. Your eyes were different.
I don't know. I was on this side.
Yeah.
They
that's
said
what
that
they
it
were
was.
telling you, yeah.
They said that it was. And I went in to see my next patient. I gave that patient an adjustment, as I normally would.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, leave your eyes closed and relax for, half a minute, so the adjustment would settle into place, as I normally would say. And when he opened his eyes, he looked at me and he said, "Who came into the room while I was lying here on the table?" I said, "No one. Why?" He said, no, like I didn't hear him. "Who walked into the room?" I said, "No one did." He said, "The person who stood by the door." I said, "No one was by the door." He said, "I heard them." I said, "They weren't there." He said, "I felt them." I said, "They weren't there." We went back and forth and back and forth, and finally he said, "Okay." But you know when someone doesn't really quite believe you. I didn't think about it much. I went into the next room. I adjusted the next patient. When she opened her eyes, she said, "Who walked into the room while I was lying here?" I said, "No one. Why?" She said, "The person at the door." I said, "There was no one there." She said, "I heard them." I said, "They weren't there." She said, "I felt them." I said, "They weren't there." This was my 12th year in practice. No one had ever said anything like this to me before, and suddenly here, on this one day, 7 of my patients.
So did you thought this was a
said this.
joke from your secretary or your assistant or something was going on?
Yes. I thought the woman at the front desk set them up. Said, "Here,
Yeah.
when you finish, say this." I really did.
Yeah.
It's funny you said that to me because I forgot that. I must have written that in the book because I forgot that. I did. I really thought that they set me up. But no, they didn't, because that was just the beginning.
Yeah, and yet you kept on experiencing new things and moving forward, and this continued to unfold. And there's some new people that came in your life, some experience that you had that made this gift keep on opening up, and you yourself, you were challenged and thinking, is this really real? What is happening?
Yeah, skeptical. more in the true meaning of the word skeptic than in the way we think of the word skeptic. We think of a skeptic as someone who refuses to believe. But that's not really what skeptical means. What skeptic means is someone who enters a situation with no preset belief one way or another. So I was...
You're still open.
Observing, shall we say. I don't know how to explain it. People say to me, well, weren't you frightened? And I'm thinking, well, it feels like I should have been, especially when I tell the story and I listen to what went on. But I wasn't. I don't know how to explain, but it felt at once like something fully awesome and unexplainable. And yet on the other hand, or at the same time I should say, it felt perfectly natural, perfectly normal. So I observed it with continuous shock and surprise, and yet at the same time, another part of me was perfectly familiar with it.
And then what happened after this lady? There was some other incidents. There was some channeling that was later on, wasn't it? How did it unfold from there?
As this continued, that's when patients started telling me they could feel my hands before I touched them.
Yeah.
I was still on the part of people saying there were people in the room. Other patients are saying, I can feel your hands. And I'm thinking, oh yes, sure you can. Close your eyes. So they'd close their eyes and I'd hold my hands, you know, aimed in different directions. They'd tell me right shoulder, left ankle. So it became a game because it was my office and I could have whatever games I wanted. And as I played this game, my palms blistered on several occasions. Tiny, tiny, tiny little blisters. Some other particularly odd things happened, including my palm bled once, not like a stigmata or anything like that, but just as if you take a little tiny pin or a needle and there was that little strange drop of blood. I mean, I didn't even notice it, except the patient underneath me was opened his eyes and staring, and we looked, and I don't know what that is. I mean, I don't know what it means. Believe me, I'm no saint. Believe me, I'm no saint. And I don't know whether I'd enjoy being one. But what I do know is that suddenly people started having healings. First they were seeing colors, intense, beautiful purples, like violet colors, that they would see light emanating from behind or out of someone. I remember someone from Disney who did their animation. He was one of the many people who saw this. He said, it couldn't possibly be reproduced here on this plane. People were seeing shapes such as triangles, then they were seeing rays of light and gold and white, and suddenly healing started happening. Real healings, healings that you think couldn't possibly occur. People started getting up out of wheelchairs, vision and hearing returning. Children with epilepsy and cerebral palsy were able to run and play and speak normally and had regained the use of their hands.
Your
and
practice
their
took
feet.
off.
Well, it wasn't quite that, but I mean, even kids with epilepsy weren't having seizures any longer, but not every person did this happen to. Not to every person.
How do you explain that?
Well, it happened to a lot of people. First, I wasn't even explaining it, I was an observation. It happened to a lot of people. It happened to enough people that we knew that something significant, something substantial was occurring. How do I explain that it didn't happen with everyone? Well, then we would probably have to understand the reason that we have and experience our health challenges.
Right.
You know, and there was a wonderful film with Ellen Burstyn back around 1980. I think she was up for an Academy Award for it. It was an incredible film called Resurrection. It wasn't religious, even though it's called Resurrection. And in it, a character, I think, who played her grandmother, said, some people need their illness to give love, some to get love. That's an insight right there.
Yeah.
Many Lives, Many Masters, written by Brian Weiss, a wonderfully insightful book, in which he began to understand through others that sometimes people are born into this role to help us with their lessons. Maybe they go through their health challenges for themselves, maybe for the lessons and evolutions of people who love them. 3 people can come in to a reconnective healing practitioner, to me or anyone else who has transcended completely their energy healing work to facilitate this. They can have the same diagnosis, the same set of symptoms, and yet receive 3 different sets of results depending upon what's most appropriate for that person at that point in their life. And we just don't understand the mind of God.
So tell me, I'm curious to know, because you were trying to find some answers and you were seeking for some answers to understand why all this was happening and what it was, and you even went to some medium. You went to see this famous medium so that he can read something and help you figure this out, no? I think I read that in your book.
You know, I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
And someone happened to mention to me that they went to this psychic who was supposed to be quite phenomenal, that everyone was going to him. The president and his wife went to him, and there was special security outside when they did it, and supposedly this was one of the special people to go to. So I called the person up. I made an appointment under my first name. I didn't say who or what, so I knew that they wouldn't have any, you know, understanding of me. They wouldn't be able to find anything out before I arrived. I showed up, and the day just happened to be one of those days that often happen with me where I was, a good 30 minutes late, and this person was a very punctual person. I mean, he was the type of person who could bring the word tardy back into fashion. So I arrived, and I was sure this was not going to be a good reading of any kind. So he's just, you know, all surly, and he lays out the cards. He looks at me, looks at the cards, and he said, "What is it that you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a chiropractor. I'm a doctor." He said, "No, it's much more. It's much more than that." He said, "Healings come through your hands. People will be coming to you from all around the world, and soon you'll be teaching this, and you'll write a book." I knew the healings had started. I also knew that there were 2 things I would never do.
Yeah.
Teach or write a book. I don't even read. I don't like to read. I think I tell people sometimes that I had a terrible tragedy. My entire library burnt down, and I didn't even finish coloring the 2nd book yet. And teaching.
Yeah.
I didn't want to teach because there was such a high from doing these healing sessions, day in and day out. I was working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. I had to force myself to not work on Sunday. There was no way I was going to leave that. But of course, the universe had another plan. First, people started calling and asking me to teach the work. I said, "How am I going to teach this? There's no way I can teach this. First of all, no one gave me an instruction manual. I don't know what this is. I'm standing there waving my hands in the air looking like an idiot. Wave your hands in the air, look like an idiot, let me know what happens." But more and more people would call me up after their sessions and say that when they got home, their garage door opened or closed by itself. They walked into their house, their lamp or television turned off and on like mine had. They felt sensations in their hands. They would hold their hands by someone in their family. And those people started having healings. The grandfather could walk again after the stroke. The uncle regained the use of his eyes or his ears. So we began to recognize that once we interact with this new, more comprehensive spectrum of healing, to the degree that we don't try to focus in the rules of techniques and shoulds and shouldn'ts, we're able to access something so comprehensive that it's virtually second nature. We almost wonder why we didn't know it before. So I found that these steps led me to finally agree to teach at certain places. people would say, "What's this called?" And I said, "It doesn't have a name." They said, "Well, it has to have a name." I said, "No, it doesn't have to have a name. Because when you name it, you say, this is what it is. That's what the name says. This is what it is. And everything else is what it isn't."
It's limiting, yeah.
Right. Well, A, I didn't know what it was. And B, I definitely didn't know what it wasn't. Because it seemed to be growing and expanding.
Even
multiple
into
times a day.
Even into channeling at some point.
Well, the channeling actually happened before this part.
Okay.
But I'll bring it back. So, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it wasn't. I didn't want to give it a name. But people started, they just couldn't stand the fact that it had no name. And so, over in the northeast of the country, they were calling it Eric Pearl Healing, and in the southeast, they were calling it Pearl High Frequency Healing, and all different places, they were giving it different names and trying to attach my name to it, and it didn't have my name. It wasn't about me. And people calling it high frequency, that's because the concept to them was high is better than low. Who says? Who says? We look at things so linearly. So finally, I decided to give it a name. The Reconnection, or Reconnective Healing. That name did come from the channelings, as you said. And I'll back into that in a minute. But the book was also something I knew I would never do. I couldn't focus in school. I couldn't do homework. I don't know how I made it through school or through graduate school. Somehow I seemed to absorb enough from sitting in the rooms to be able to pass the exams well. But writing a book, that was my biggest fear. I didn't know how to organize, I didn't know how to write. And someone took a tape recording of a small presentation I gave to a group and sent it to Hay House. They called me back and said, "Here's a check, write a book, here's the due date." I agreed, and I guess that was the pressure that I needed to force me into doing that. And now the book, it's called The Reconnection, Heal Others, Heal Yourself, is, well, you've got the French, you've got the French version in your hand.
By Ariane Publisher.
Ariane Publishing in Montreal.
Yeah.
The Hay House sells the international rights. It's already in 30-some languages and growing. I spend right now about 45 weeks a year teaching this work. We've trained so far over about 70,000 practitioners in full weekend seminars around the globe. A good 20% of them, approximately, are mainstream medical doctors, nurses, physical therapists, health care practitioners. Another maybe 30% are masters and grandmasters in the energy healing technique, Qigong and Reiki and all the new ones that come out as well as the old. Because once they reach that level, they recognize that although the technique has brought them closer to being able to access healing, the technique itself becomes the glass ceiling. It becomes the limiting factor, just as when training wheels on a bicycle allow you to begin to access your sense of balance. If you add more training wheels, you don't get better. If you add more techniques or study more of a technique, you don't get better. But as the masters have always taught us throughout time, the true gift of a technique comes only once you transcend it. Our teachers today just don't all seem to be masters. They tell us, come back and learn more, come back and learn more. Write me another check. My husband will love to deposit it. You can come back and learn more. And the masters tell us, don't come back. They need the seat. They need the seat because there's always a new student as long as there is truth to be taught. And that the gift of mastery comes only when we transcend the technique itself. So anyway, somehow or other, I focused. I got the book out. It was one of the biggest challenges in my life. I hired a ghostwriter because I knew I couldn't do it. Gave the ghostwriter tapes of my presentations, tapes of interviews, let him interview people that I knew, spent lots of time answering all of his questions. He finally sent me something back that had some right and some things that, I don't know, maybe he misunderstood. So I made all the corrections carefully in the manuscript. And just as I was ready to send it back to him, he'd give me an expanded manuscript where he'd lost some of the real things in it that belonged, and added things that he made up that didn't belong. And so then I started making a correction on that, comparing it with the first one, then a third one, and a fourth one. One day I'm looking at my dining room table. I've got like 7 different versions of something that was so obscured. It was like, you know when you cut open an avocado that's too ripe and it's got kind of that brown stringy stuff growing through it?
Yeah.
That's what had happened to this book.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, here's this avocado, and I have to figure out how to extract all those little brown things and still have an avocado. And so finally I realized that what I had to do was pay him to leave, so that I then had to face the biggest challenge of my life, which was write a book. I had to take what was there, extract it, and I spent the next couple months up to the deadline living on the top of my bed, living on my bed. King-size bed, computer here, put it in front of me. I'd work, I'd eat, I'd work, I'd eat. Suddenly it would roll into daylight the next morning. I'd close the computer, I'd lie down and go to sleep. Next morning I'd sit up, bring the computer, and start again. And I had to make this deadline. And whatever the deadline date was, it was right before the Christmas holidays. It was so hard for me. I mean, I cannot tell you how hard that was. And right by the deadline, I finally called and I said, well, this is the best it can be. I didn't want to give them a book that was good enough. I made it the best that I could get it, but this was not my area. And the editor said, well, I can't really look at it for another 5 or 7 days, so you can keep it for 1 more week. So I said, all right. And I started to work on it again, and somewhere in there I found the flow. I don't know how, but I just found the flow. I got rid of the things that didn't work, arranged the things that did, and at the end of the week I called her up and said, you can't have it. You can't have it because it's not where it can be, and I know I can get it there. And I kept it for about another month, and now it was my book. And now I could give it to them, and now I knew that we had the right product. And then as soon as it was out, people started coming to me saying, when are you writing your next book? When are you writing your next book? And I said, as soon as I recover from writing this one. Now, after a couple of years, the answer changed to as soon as I have something else to say. Because the reconnection is written on so many layers that no matter how many times you pick it up, if you're aware as you read, you find more. I didn't intend to write it that way consciously, but that's what it is. I do finally plan this year. I'm going to end the tour this year somewhere before Christmas and not resume again until the beginning of May of 2011. And it is my plan, you know what plans are, but it's my plan and my intention to write a second book now.
On
a deeper understanding of this material.